Right, a very warm welcome this evening to another in my series of great Victorian artists. And tonight I'm introducing an artist who kind of links with a number of the other significant painters of late Victorian England. And it is Lawrence Alma-Tadema. And I've subtitled this Reimagining the Ancient World because it's not necessarily all about Alma-Tadema, but it is this particular strain of art. When we a couple of years ago I talked on Lord Leighton, but Tadema fills a vacuum in many ways, and certainly we learn a lot about the Victorian art market and taste in late Victorian England from an examination of Tadema's work. So tonight I propose to go through his career and how it interacted with both the art in Europe and particularly the art in London and the collectors in Great Britain. And also just his legacy as well, which is important when we consider his decline as seen as an important artist following the First World War. So, when there was a show of Tadema's work at Metropolitan Museum in New York City some time ago, it was mischievously entitled Victorians in Togas. And it also paralleled the idea that, like Constantine's Rome, Alma-Tadema continued to rise from his fall. Now, in my photographs this evening, many are taken from Creative Commons. I have been able to photograph a few of Tadema's paintings up close myself, and some of the others are from my own collection of photographs. I begin here really with where it begins with the 19th century fascination with the classical world, and particularly the President of the Royal Academy, Benjamin West, at the beginning of the 19th century. And we see Archibald Archer's painting there of the temporary Elgin Room at the British Museum in 1819. And with the arrival of the Parthenon marbles into London was a very important part of the classical revival in Victorian, later into Victorian England. And of course, it was already well underway at the turn of the 19th century, particularly evidenced in the architecture and monumental masons' work as well. But it slowly becomes a very, very important strand of high Victorian art. And we're going to follow that through. We learn a lot about how the Victorians' interest in archaeology and uncovering the world of the past, and the artists, particularly Leighton and Tadema, were also quite expert and thorough in their examination of archaeological sites and trying to reconstruct them with great veracity. So we'll look at Tadema. He was born in Friesland in 1836. He was a reasonably comfortable family. He became a British citizen after in the 1880s, but he settles in London in 1870, and his early work is not necessarily not classical as such. It is more of a historical genre scenes, and it has something even of a pre-Raphaelite flavour. But it was following his honeymoon and a visit to Pompeii in 1863 that he really fell in love really with the ancient world. And his paintings, as we shall see, also point the way to really the Hollywood film industry of the 20th century, and indeed have even been referenced in many films, particularly of the early movies and later the Cecil B. DeMille's reconstructions of the ancient world. So he continues to be an important artist in that way. Punch magazine quipped, they called him a marvelous artist. There was no artist who could paint marble better than Alma-Tadema. And he was enormously successful as financially successful. He had a very lavish lifestyle in the 1880s, 1890s, through to his death in 1912. He had already made something of a name for himself in Europe, and he acquired almost every honour going in Victorian England. He was eventually knighted in 1899, and he received the Order of Merit, which was the final crown of his career. And he dies at Wiesbaden in 1912, following the death of his second wife. Here we are with a very early self-portrait, age 16, 1852. So we can already see that Tadema follows in the tradition of many great 19th century artists, being a very competent painter at a very young age. He actually becomes a painter really as a result of ill health. And because of his poor health from about the age of 12, he spent time drawing and painting, and so he becomes quite precocious at art, but he eventually overcomes his illnesses and sets out on an artistic career. It's similar in many ways to the prodigies of England as well, particularly Edwin Landseer, John Everett Millais, and Joseph Maillard William Turner. All of them were proficient artists before the age of 15. And this is the case with Alma-Tadema. So he's a very highly skilled artist. He's an artist who initially follows in the Dutch tradition, and particularly Dutch genre painting plays an important part in his early work. And he has a close affinity with the high finished surfaces of Dutch genre painting from the 17th century. So we're looking at people like De Hoogh and Vermeer and artists of that nature who could paint very fine cabinet pictures. And indeed, Tadema throughout his career is an artist whose technique is often pointed to as marvelously proficient and a wonderful draftsman, whatever other comments people have about his work. He was not an artist who was troubled by problems of perspective or indeed the technique of his paintings. Many see his paintings as far too tight, but we shall come to that. So he ends up under the master Baron Leys in Antwerp. Doesn't find that he isn't able to enter an art school in Holland, his native Holland, so he comes down from Friesland and he spends time in Antwerp. Antwerp is an enormous centre for art in this period of the 19th century, in the 1850s and 60s. It is a big centre, and the artists of Antwerp lived in considerable style, and Baron Leys was one of the most celebrated muralists and painters of Antwerp at the time, and the Antwerp Academy. He was a very hard taskmaster. Tadema learned much from him technically. And if we look at the middle slide here, you can see this picture. This medieval scene. This was partly by Tadema's hand under the tutorship of Baron Leys. And it is in fact in his studio that Tadema starts to develop his own interest in historical painting. Very often they're multi-figured, and throughout his career his paintings are complicated. He fits a lot into a small space. He doesn't necessarily always paint on a large scale. Some of his most famous works are quite large. We're talking some of them are up to 5 feet, but a lot of his paintings are what we call cabinet paintings. So we're talking something under 2 feet wide. So they're not large paintings very often with Tadema, but because of their fastidious technique, he often could paint no more than 6 paintings a year, so he was quite restricted in the number of paintings he could do because of the very high finished technique of his work. The one at the bottom right, The Education of the Children of Clovis from 1860, is an excellent example of Tadema's first engagement with the Roman world, and he actually, again, to the best of his knowledge, he tries to access the best archaeological details for his work, and he's very thorough with that. He sees the work of art as something that requires a lot of taking notes. Latterly, it took a lot of photographs, a lot of small watercolor studies on the spot as well. So he's an artist who spends a lot of time preparing his paintings and doing some very, very highly finished drawings and studies for each painting. So if we look at this period of the 19th century, the artists who we might cite today as the great artists of the 19th century, for instance, Claude Monet, Paul Gauguin, Edward Manet, they don't appear in this group at all. These are the artists are known as the school of the 19th century. And Tadema appears on the outer edge there, flanked by John Everett Millais. Below him is Edwin Landseer. We look at Raphael Mengs. Baron Leys, I've got a little arrow to him. Few would be able to cite him today unless they really researched it. And of course, the great Delacroix and Ingres form the centre of the group. But of course, it's a group of predominantly middle-aged white men who are hardly necessarily what we would consider bohemians, and very different from the sort of, when we go into art museums today, we wouldn't necessarily consider these people as the greatest artists of the 19th century. But certainly this painting, which is in Nice, which illustrates the great school of the 19th century, Tadema was considered one of the greats of the late 19th century. If you notice in the background, there's a little bit of the Parthenon frieze in the background as well. So all of these people were greatly influenced by an academic and a classical education as well. And so this is a painting I often refer to because it really points up the world that just really came to the end with the turn of the new century, and of course the whole advent of the birth of modernism and new styles and new values in art. The art of Tadema and Leighton and the Victorian classical artists really emerged earlier from ideas in the emerging in the 19th century, epitomised the Dean of Christ Church, Oxford, Thomas Gaisford, particularly commented in a sermon that Greek literature not only elevates above the vulgar herd, but leads not infrequently to positions of considerable emolument. So it was a move. It was people like Gaisford and, of course, latterly Matthew Arnold, the poetry of Bulwer Lytton and Algernon Swinburne all refer to the Hellenism and to the Greco-Roman world, and this forms the basis for much of this other great strand in Victorian art that wasn't influenced by the Gothic, the medieval, or the Christian. It was the other side of it was the classical, and of course classical education was such an important part of a Victorian gentleman's education, and indeed it works its way into public tastes in Victorian painting. So these are important figures if one considers the sort of philosophical background to why painters like Alma-Tadema became so important to late Victorian England. Another reason why Tadema shot to preeminence was really a fortuitous meeting with the great picture dealer of the late 19th century, Ernest Gambart. Now, Gambart really could make artists' careers in Europe. He was an enormously successful picture dealer. Allegedly, and there are two stories about it, but he met Tadema mistakenly coming to his studio, not knowing it was Tadema's studio, and Gambart sees Tadema's painting upon the easel and offers to buy it, not thinking initially it's by an unknown. But he offers to buy it, and from that point on, Gambart buys up most of Tadema's work. Gambart made an enormous amount of money from not just that he bought the rights to each painting, and of course we live from the 1860s. There was the possibility of actually reproducing them photographically, but also in mezzotints and engravings. And these additions after these great artists were a way of distributing the work and making even more money from the work. Gambart, of course, was he sold Holman Hunt's work, The Finding of the Saviour in the Temple, and again, so he was an excellent dealer. And he also had very, very good European connections. And at this stage, Tadema moves to Brussels and is working in Brussels. He hasn't yet been to London, but he's already quite well established with Gambart. And later on, Tadema would be showing at the Grosvenor Gallery in New Bond Street, which hosted a very, very important exhibition of Alma-Tadema's work in 1882, sort of like a retrospective on his career, and at the French Gallery in Pall Mall. So Gambart plays an enormously important part in bringing Tadema's work to prominence and establishing Tadema as a very wealthy artist. Some of these artists, and if you've ever been to Antwerp, you can go to part of the city there and indeed parts of Brussels, in Schaerbeek particularly, and you'll see the studios that artists had, and even completely forgotten artists that lived like kings, really. They had wonderful studios with very often with replicas of the Parthenon frieze around them, and enormous north-light windows and many floors. They lived in grand style, and they were bourgeois artists, really. And they were not the way we think of artists today from the late 19th century, like Van Gogh or Monet. They weren't living hand to mouth. These people were extremely well rewarded for what they did. And we see in Tadema's paintings, and really the reason I'm just darting about in dates here is that Tadema's style after 1870 really changes very little. There are very few stylistic changes in Tadema's work following his arrival in London in 1870. But his paintings often concern groups of people who are looking at sculpture galleries or looking at paintings. And indeed, he even paints himself in a background of, you can see him in the background of the one on the left, that he is the figure in the straw hat looking at the easel. And then, of course, again, very much the Victorians in togas painting the picture gallery, 1874, so similar to one of Gambart's salons of Victorian picture buyers in Roman garb, in a way. But of course, Tadema is already trying to pick up from what he has seen in Pompeii of the idea that there were some great painters in ancient Rome, and that they painted in encaustic waxes and balsams, and of course we know we still have a few Roman paintings that have survived, but of course most are lost and have decayed over the centuries. But so Tadema reimagines what it was like to be in Pompeii, and of course, following his first trip in 1863, he really continually engages with that and that excitement about what the ancient world must have been like, and in a way, he takes a Hollywood approach to reconstructing a world and making it a believable world. That these Romans weren't so distant from our own times in many ways, and the way they interacted with one another. He's also very clever with composition, is Tadema. He can get an awful lot into a small space, and this is because of his masterful draftsmanship. So the first painting that really broke him in on the scene was the Vintage Festival, which is this long frieze-like painting. And I've given you a little detail from it there. Incredibly detailed, multi-figured. So it's very different in many respects to some of the other Victorian artists of the time. But it is one of these Victorian paintings which is very much based on a sarcophagus or an entablature on a sarcophagus, and so it is the processional painting. Poynter painted such, as did Leighton as well. And indeed, we get a hint of that in Fred Walker from 1867 in his painting The Bathers. But that is, of course, set by probably by the River Thames and a sort of very British scene, almost a genre scene. But these were beginning to become sought after paintings, and certainly with some of the the industrialists of Victorian England, they saw themselves both in the paintings, but they also saw these wonderful paintings as covering, making very good fittings into their new mansions that were springing up all over Great Britain at the time. And it was that Tadema came to London, like so many artists, because of the Franco-Prussian War. He wanted to get out of Europe, mainland Europe, and so him and Tissot, indeed even Pissarro and Monet came to London at the same time, although of a very different makeup. Those two were hardly mainstream figures in art at the time. Certainly they had no contact with the likes of Alma-Tadema, but Tadema was readily accepted, and it was realized quite quickly by artists like Leighton, Poynter and Millet as a significant force, because of his sheer skill and his ability with the paintbrush, and is able to evoke the ancient world in such a way. And certainly by 1870 his palette had considerably lightened, and the heaviness of his early work had disappeared, and his works were full of this wonderful Italianate light, which so permeates all of his paintings, really. This is an example of one of his Egyptian subjects. Tadema was very interested in Egypt, and he throughout his life he does travel to Egypt, and he paints a number of Egyptian subjects. He isn't the first, hardly, to go to Egypt. Particularly Roberts had spent quite a bit of time in Egypt, and Lewis as well in the earlier Victorian period. But it was George Elbers who ignited Tadema's interest in archaeology, and Tadema sought as much accurate information as he possibly could get, and consulted with archaeologists as he put the paintings together. It would also be noted that Tadema, like Holman Hunt, took a great deal of interest in making the whole object, the work of art was the frame as well. So the setting of the painting was as important as the painting itself. And throughout his career, Tadema was a formidable designer. He designed costumes. In fact, he did design costumes for Ellen Terry's theatre productions. He designed chairs and materials and fabrics as well, and clothing. So Tadema was an especially good at those sort of things. He didn't rely on lay models, and everything was planned out. This, the death of Pharaoh's firstborn, very popular subject. There was artists like Edwin Long at the time at the Royal Academy, and of course a biblical subject too, which brings the biblical and the classical worlds together, was a surefire winner, really. And of course the pathos also of Pharaoh's the death of the firstborn of Pharaoh in the last of the plagues of Egypt, a very important subject which attracted, and it particularly attracted an increasingly important Jewish clientele as well, who were very interested in such subjects as this. And again, through Gambart by this stage was able to release a lot of the works that he had bought and saved by Tadema, and now could release them on the British art market. Gambart was a very, very canny dealer. And it was really in 1865 that we first see the Royal Academy seriously engaging with the Roman world and the Roman Empire. And again, it's this whole thing of there's a lot going on in Victorian painting in the mid-1860s, but certainly among the academicians and the up-and-coming younger artists, particularly Edward Poynter and John Everett Millet, there's also this concern about the fate of empire as the British Empire expands. And so we can see that in particularly Edward Poynter's Faithful Unto Death, which depicts a Roman centurion standing in the streets of Pompeii while the fireballs from the volcano fall upon the city and cover the city. This was a painting that attracted many Victorians, and a very important painting in Victorian England. Likewise, Millet's The Romans Leaving Britain from 1865. Typically of Millet, it concerns the idea of a Roman centurion who had fallen in love with a Briton, and yet he would have to leave her. And of course, this is a typical Millet subject, really, and it was based on Holinshed's history of the British peoples, and it has a sort of romantic tinge to it as well. But it certainly was a subject matter which was now becoming increasingly important in the Royal Academy, and artists liked Roman subject matter or Greek subject matter. Both these strands were beginning to become increasingly important. And also, as there was a greater interest in painting the human figure, and the nude was reintroduced into the Royal Academy after many years of it, since the time of William Etty being almost absent from the walls of the Royal Academy. So it was the time of a great imperial expansion, of course, and the maps went pink, and so it was a time really when playing upon the idea of empire became very important in painting. And so here's Alma-Tadema's painting of 1867. Proclaiming Claudius as emperor from 1867. This is before Tadema moves to London. However, paintings like this then became, he did other versions of various emperors, particularly Hadrian, who obviously, because of Hadrian's association with the British Isles, that was also something that was very important to Tadema. And obviously, it's not entirely my subject tonight, but the whole idea of the expansion of the British Empire sort of runs in parallel to the imperial subjects that Tadema particularly picked in his work, and indeed Poynter, and they were celebrated as such. That's the Victoria Memorial, which we see quite a lot of in a couple of days' time, by Sir Thomas Brock, who was one of the famous sculptors of late Victorian England. He in fact, was the sculptor of Lord Leighton's marvellous tomb in St Paul's Cathedral. And so I think a lot of us got introduced to the whole idea of this strand of Victorian art with William Gaunt's book, back from the 1970s, the Victorian Olympus. Figure 1 is Frederick Lord Leighton. Figure 2 is the outsider, but considered the great artist of Victorian England, G.F. Watts, who I gave a little talk about a few months ago, and of course his embrace of classical subjects and in a symbolic framework. Figure 3 is Edward Poynter, who became president of the Royal Academy following John Everett Millet's death in 1896. And figure 4 is Alma-Tadema himself. So these are the 4 greats of late Victorian painting. Okay. So one of the great paintings of the early 1870s is the catapult. Again, Poynter concerns himself with muscular male energy, and this is a big subject that was important in Victorian painting, and a very important Roman subject as well. It happens at the same time as there are British military campaigns throughout the empire, so it again brings out that parallel. But it's a remarkable piece of painting. But Tadema is different to Poynter in that Tadema does, by and large, he does do a few paintings of gladiators and something of the Roman games, but he doesn't really do military paintings in the way that Poynter did. And then again, he has a different attitude to Leighton, who's an Andromache, who meditates upon the fate of Hector's wife, displaced outside outside of her people, and the plight of the Trojan women. So there are always these big subjects that come into these greats of Victorian painting. But Tadima's tend to be more like Dutch genre paintings. They're not on the scale of Leighton, and they also are not trying to press home a point that, for instance, you would get in a painting like the Catapult. But he was concerned with the nude, and in fact, probably as a painter of the human body, Tadema is one of the greatest artists of the latter part of the Victorian period. In fact, this painting here had to be cut out of a painting on the Emperor Hadrian visiting a British pottery, and so this Romana British potter was a cut portion of a painting of Hadrian visiting the pottery, and it was thought indecent, which you know, to our modern eyes we wouldn't have thought that. We think it was a rather lovely painting of a male semi-nude, and indeed it comes at the same time that Leighton is celebrated sculpture of the athlete wrestling with a python, or indeed G.F. Watts's Physical Energy, which are the two terrific pieces of Victorian sculpture. The same year as Auguste Rodin's The Age of Bronze. And of course, some of us may know that Rodin was accused of actually casting, so lifelike was the surface of the figure in The Age of Bronze, that so lifelike was the nude there, that he was accused of casting it from a real person. But of course, that wasn't the case. But in the same way, Tadema is really knowledgeable about the musculature. He shows all his training under Baron Leys here. He gets all the weights exactly right, and it's a beautiful piece of figure painting. But again, it was thought indecent by some Victorians, and therefore he had to cut the painting into three portions, and it's now actually as three different paintings. You can hear the history. You can see the history of that, and it's talked about in Alison Smith's wonderful book on the Victorian nude. So Alma-Tadema settles in a house which was owned by Frederick Goodall in St John's Wood, not far from the Regent's Canal. And we got a little, it's a Townshend house, and there's a little watercolor of this sort of, the style that some of these Victorian artists lived in was incredible. That just gives you an idea of it. What Goodall was, of course, a kindred spirit, and he spent a lot of his time away in Egypt and the Middle East, and painting this type of subject. We got the Arab village there with the pyramids in the background. However, whilst Tadema was at this studio, which was still quite a fine studio, we've seen some lovely pictures of it, there was a large barge explosion on the Regent's Park Canal, and there's a little picture of it there, and it really demolished a lot of the properties, including a Townshend house, so this was a bit of a shock to the Tadema family. It was also a difficult period in Tadema's life. Come to London following the death of his first wife, but he marries again, and his second wife he actually employs as a painter, and she becomes a very competent painter herself, and they have a very happy marriage. Tadema had to initially bring his children up by himself with the help of servants. But obviously his income is good throughout, and St John's Wood was where he was to settle as an artist. And in fact, by the 1880s, he actually then moves to his own studio, which is in St John's Wood in 44 Grove End Road, and there's the plaque outside it. It's now broken up into flats. The Grove End Road is, of course, was James Tissot, the other artist from France who came over during the Franco-Prussian War, the friend of Edouard Manet, and a very celebrated Victorian painter, much hated by Ruskin, but much loved by the Victorian public for his beautifully illustrative style and wonderful, sumptuous colours and brushwork. And rather like Tadema in a way, he was concerned with minute detail and beauty, and particularly the life of the idle rich, which so infuriated Ruskin. Tadema was worked closely by the studio of John William Waterhouse, the latter-day pre-Raphaelite painter. And so those two studios are close to each other, close to Regent's Park anyway. And you can't actually visit the studio anymore. And I think not a great deal of it still exists, but that's a little photograph of it from the library in London, in Kensington Library. But I've got a photograph of it inside. So it was a very, very sumptuous inside. The left hand is the one, 1902, and there's a series in a magazine of art which looks at Tadema's studio, and he was living in some style. He had a Roman entablature throughout the studio. Each one of those is a panel of a painting, often donated by friends. So some people like Leighton and Goodward and other artists had donated a panel. And even the piano was beautifully painted, and there were bearskin rugs, and his studio was comparable to Leighton's studio. And of course, we know at the same time Leighton was developing his wonderful studio in Holland Park and the Arab Hall at Leighton House, which, if you haven't been to it and you come to London, do please visit Leighton House, because that will give you a real flavour for the high life of the greatest of the Victorian artists. There's a little card with Alma-Tadema on it. I thought you'd like to see that. It's him actually sort of posing for painting. He was quite keen on having his photograph taken, like so many of these great Victorian artists. They all seem to paint in immaculate suits and never get a spot of paint upon them. One can almost believe it in Tadema's case, because he's so particular and so careful in his application of paint. You can't imagine there'll be any sort of wild splashes of colour like you would get with a Claude Monet or a Van Gogh. But he was not universally loved, and certainly Ruskin's criticisms of Alma-Tadema are quite scathing in places. Whilst Ruskin appreciated the historical veracity of much of Tadema's work, he was very critical of its what he considered the shallow and often, as he would see it, as immoral subjects, and particularly the women here in this particular one, the women who lie exhausted after the dance, was seen as indelicate in Victorian England, and you were never to show women with any sweat on their bodies, or you all of that was a no-no really, and it only escaped censure because it was set in a Roman setting. But again, beautifully painted. But certainly Ruskin was very alive to what he considered the immorality of some of Tadema's paintings. Again, we get this in Gérôme's work as well, in France. Edwin Long, particularly the Egyptian slave market, which is at the Russell Coates Gallery in Bournemouth as well, emphasises art from this particular period, and paintings now which may appear to many as problematic paintings. But nevertheless, they are beautifully painted. One can say that they've got a great deal of vigor to them, and there's a lot going on in them, and they're perfect in their perspective as well. And they're almost like little, as if somebody had taken almost a colour photograph in ancient Rome and somehow transported it into modern times. So I do recommend Alison Smith's book, The Victorian Nude, because it says so much about how the Victorian nude became, once again, an important subject matter for artists following 1870. Particularly, the first full nude to be, since Williametti, to be on the walls of the Royal Academy was Leighton's Venus Disrobing for a Bath from 1868. And then we have Helios and Rhodes, and then the controversial painting by Millet, The Knight Errant, which was particularly thought of as immoral because it featured a knight in full armor and a woman undressed. And indeed, initially the head had faced forward, which was seen as seductive and lewd. And in fact, Millet had to cut the head out and repaint it so it could be sold. And it was always a problem. But Alison Smith discusses these problems. And you can imagine, because this was a period when there was almost like a policing of this type of work. It was not. It was an artist's career could be certainly very much damaged if the nude was depicted in any way less than in a classical setting, or it had to be only within certain confines could it be acceptable to the Victorian public and picture buying public. But of course, Leighton's nudes and Tadema's nudes became highly saleable, and so we can sort of see its parallels what was going on in France, particularly in the earlier part of the 19th century. We have Jean-Dominique Arng, particularly his painting La Source is a good example of the nude within continental Europe. And of course, at the same time, Bouguereau's paintings, Evening Mood, and so many of his paintings, the sculptural nude body, female body particularly, were very important to French academic art of the time. And indeed, we see that echoed in Leighton's work as well. Leighton very much looked to Bouguereau's work as well in the stylistic finish, and the finish of his work is akin to Bouguereau's work. And certainly Tadema was very well aware and alive to the continental artist's finish. But certainly for Tadema, it was about detail as much as anything else, and to bring it into the nude into a new context. And so this is probably his most controversial painting, in the Tepidarium. Painted in his studio. The woman lies on a bearskin rug. It is obviously, to modern eyes, we can read so much into it. I mean, in a post-Freudian world, one can read a lot into the strigil. That is the woman is holding the implement in her hand, which is apparently you wipe the oil off the body following your bath at the Roman bath. So this was a very controversial painting. It's a small scale painting. This one's at, I think, the Lady Lever Art Gallery, but a very good example of which Alison Smith cites of how Tadema's work could be very controversial and obviously very sensuous in the way that Rodin's work is as well. And it's been pointed out in a particular book, which I found a great deal of pleasure reading, actually, is Richard Jenkins' book, Dignity and Decadence. And Jenkins comments on this, and he parallels it with Manet's Olympia in a way. He says, in the Tepidarium gives ancient Rome a modern flavour, whilst Manet invests a modern courtesan with a classical distinction. So it's almost like the reverse of Manet in a way. Manet bringing a Parisian courtesan to the point of a sort of classical pose, whereas this, where Tadema's one really brings it into a sort of a Roman context, or something that is fully alive and real. So it's an interesting parallel, and certainly Jenkins explores that in his book, and I find that too. Also, you might notice just under the bearskin rug there on the little step, you notice an opus number, and every single one of Tadema's paintings have an opus number, mainly because there were some fake Tademas going about in the early years when he came under Gambart, and so he then makes a Roman opus number on all of his work. That's one of his most famous paintings, is at the Getty in Los Angeles, Spring, which shows one of these great processional paintings. Perhaps this is unusual because of its multi-figured composition, but it's also has a sort of joy to it as well, and full of colour, full of life, and full of accurate detail as well. And as such, it was used as a basis for the 1934 film Cleopatra, and Cecil B. DeMille's Cleopatra based much of the set upon Tadema's work. So the Tadema had a strong afterlife, even though his paintings were now no longer popular in that part of the 20th century. They certainly still informed much that went on in Hollywood, as we shall see. And that's a good example. This is Tadema's painting of Cleopatra from 1877. And as you can see, the frame is almost, it is part of the work of art itself. Rather like the Viennese succession, they saw in the early part of the 20th century, they saw the placement of a work of art or the frame as of equal significance to the painting itself. And of course, that was beloved by the picture buying public in late 19th century England, particularly. Tadema was a very brilliant watercolorist as well. I've got you two examples from the sale rooms at Sotheby's. And they are, as you can see, he is just a master in his handling of paint. One could hardly believe that that was a watercolor on the left, and yet it is. And anybody who knows how to paint in watercolor knows how difficult it is to master that. And particularly as he doesn't use body color, he's just using watery pigments and has to get it right first time. He's similar to John Singer Sargent, is an absolute master of the watercolor medium. And Tadema would be nowhere. He makes without making all these studies. And this is an example of one of his sketches. So when he goes to Rome, he spends, like as did Leighton and all the other classical artists, they would spend a great deal of time in Rome, around the Forum, painting the buildings. And this is unusual, you know, because it's quite loose in a way for Tadema, but it's interesting. You can see where the little pins went onto his drawing board on that one. And I always think it's interesting as an artist to look to see how an artist constructs a painting. It has to be said that Tadema's paintings fall very much into a certain genre of painting within late Victorian art. Particularly, I would draw the parallel with Marcus Stone's work. Marcus Stone, who also lived in Holland Park and was part of Lord Leighton's circle, but very much nothing like as serious an artist as Lord Leighton, or indeed even Tadema. But we can see that from Marcus Stone's Two's Company, Three's None, there's almost a parallel, except one is in sort of early 19th century costume, and the one on the right is in Roman costume. You might say, well, there is a distinct. It's doing the same thing. It's just a change of costume, really. And I'm sure Tadema is fully aware of Stone's work, as Stone was aware of Tadema's work. So and both were enormously successful. Stone's work, particularly through his engravings, did particularly well. I mean, he was a very, very celebrated Victorian artist who's almost sunk without a trace now. But his paintings were at the time considered, along with Edmund Blair Leighton's, as important Victorian paintings. Good examples too. We're looking at different types. The approach also looking at things like music, which is an important subject in genre painting. Of course, it always has been. You get it in Vermeer's paintings of people playing a guitar or at a virginal. So Tadema, the same, brings out his Dutch influences in this one. But of course, it's set in a Roman setting. And then, of course, Leighton also realised the potential of music also within his work. And that lovely one, The Music Lesson, is in the Guildhall Art Gallery in London. And of course, if we think of the same period in France, we have Renoir painting Two Girls at the Piano. And of course, these days, many in the art world would celebrate Renoir's painting and would dismiss possibly Tadema and Leighton as sort of retrograde and not as important. But I think you've got to look at these people in on their own terms and not necessarily put them in competition with one another. This is a particularly fine painting. So many people consider this one of Tadema's finest paintings. That is a reading from Homer, 1885. In point of fact, he even had the lyre in the background made. Tadema designed that, and this gives a great example of his beautiful aesthetics in colour, the beautiful azure of presumably the sea just below the Aegean Sea, just below the pediment and the temple, but a wonderful piece of painting, really. If we look at the person just leaning on the marble there, and the way the feet fold over one another, you know, he has absolute masterful understanding of anatomy, and an incredible piece of drawing. And another thing about Tadema is you're really drawn into the scene yourself. You certainly can see, but you become a part of, you become as one listening to this reading from Homer as well. This one is was quite a controversial painting too, because this is a picture, this is called The Roses of Heliogabalus, from 1888. Very important painting in many ways, but it's actually its sweetness in its beautiful pinks and blues has a darker side to it, because it is actually a Roman orgy where the guests at the orgy are being crushed by the weight of rose petals. And so it's rather a startling thing when one knows what the story is behind it. But it's a highly celebrated painting. Point out too that Tadema, unlike Whistler, would paint every single rose petal, and so these are very, very finely wrought paintings. And if you look at that, even that green marble on the right there, I mean, very few people could paint in quite that with quite that skill and differentiate that green of the marble to the bronzed figures in the background against the sky. And there are many beautiful drawings for this particular painting as well. And again, like Leon Jerome, Tadema also painted a number of scenes from the Coliseum, and this is one of Caracalla. And it is estimated, somebody's gone out of their way to do this, that he painted all 2,000 figures in the background, which is quite something. And they're not just little blurs or dashes of paint. Every single figure is painted in some, in some detail. And so this is, again, very well researched, and certainly to the extent of the late 19th century, very, very well known. But it doesn't concern what goes on in the pit below at the Coliseum. You don't see any lions tearing people apart below. You don't see any of that. It concerns some of the little scenes that are going off at the side, and the woman's gaze towards us. And we don't even see the face of the emperor in this particular painting. So it was always Oscar Wilde's comment, but it sums up this whole thing about late Victorian art, that in France every bourgeois wants to be an artist, whereas in England every artist wants to be bourgeois. And it's true, artists in late Victorian England, certainly those of the Academy, lived in considerable style, and it's probably why their fall from grace was so great following the First World War, and their debunking by the artists, the Bloomsbury artists, and the modernists. They were seen as just upholding a whole system of values that were no longer seemed important to the 20th century. And so it is only in the last 40 years that there's been a complete rehabilitation of Tadema, Millet, and Leighton particularly. This painting is a good example of that. 1904, we move into the new century. The Finding of Moses, a marvelous painting. So it's got lovely colour to it. It's got wonderful architectural details. The infant Moses is taken in his rush basket from the River Nile, and Pharaoh's daughter is gazing upon Moses. This painting apparently was acquired for its frame in the 1950s, and the painting itself was sort of thrown out. If only they knew that in 2010 it sold for $35,922,500. So you could have made an absolute killing had you been around in the 1950s or early 60s. You could have picked up these Tademas, and it's been pointed out that in the 1880s, one painting by Tadema could have bought all the Monets in the world, whereas probably by the 1930s, one Monet could probably have bought all the Tademas in the world. And so such was the reversal of fortune for Victorian painting. So Tadema continues to paint right up to the end of his life. And he really, the style doesn't particularly develop. This one, a favourite custom, is from 1909, 3 years before his death. Alma-Tadema is buried in the crypt at St Paul's Cathedral, near many other of the great Victorian artists. His wife preceded him. She died at the age of 57 in 1909, the year of this painting. Tadema himself dies in Wiesbaden in Germany, and he's aged 76. And on his death, he was, like the Leighton's death and Millet's death, he was much lamented, and it was thought of as one of the greats passing. But of course, 2 years later, we have the end of a whole era and the beginning of the First World War, and then the fall away, the great fall away from accepting of the art of the Victorian era. And we move into the era of Gustav Klimt or Henry Matisse, and they're painting these paintings at the same time that as Tadema is in his twilight years, and the Viennese succession. Although one can see elements within the Viennese succession of Tadema's paintings, particularly his frames and his aesthetics, come out in places in Klimt's work particularly. But it was critics like Roger Fry who tried to sort of just shovel the whole of Tadema's career, along with many other Victorian artists, into a very deep grave, believing that they would never again rise to any kind of prominence. And so this little quote is from Roger Fry. His art, and that means Tadema's art, demands nothing from the spectator beyond the most unavoidable knowledge that there was such a thing as the Roman Empire, whose people were very rich, very luxurious, and in retrospect, at least agreeably wicked. That being agreed upon, Sir Lawrence proceeded to satisfy all the futile inquiries of that indolent curiosity might make about the domestic belongings of daily trifles of those people. Not that he ever makes them real people. He does, however, add the information that all the people of that interesting and remote people, all their furniture, clothes, and even their splendid marble divans were made of highly scented soap. Roger Fry, 1913. So that pretty much sums up the Bloomsbury view of Tadema and his ilk. But it isn't the end of the story. And I'm thankful for that too, because whilst I wouldn't say Tadema was in the top rank of artists, his work is still much loved by the public today. Similarly, as we had in about 4 years ago at Manchester City Art Gallery, we had the removal of Waterhouse's painting Hylas and the Water Nymphs. And there's always been controversy surrounding the painting of the nude, and in the late Victorian England completely. Linley Sambourne, in his Punch cartoon, depicts J.C. Horsley, Horsley was a big critic of Tadema and Leighton and Waterhouse for depicting the nude in art, and wanted to was highly indignant about these type of paintings. And indeed, the modern artists Sonia Boyce and Claire Ganaway again comment upon this type of art, and it's once again in our own period of culture wars, it's become a hot topic in the art world. But Tadema has the last laugh, really, because it is Tadema who really becomes very, very important, and along with Edward Poynter, to the new film industry, which was to emerge in USA, and particularly in Hollywood. And so Edward Poynter's Israel in Egypt from 1867 is in fact the template for Cecil B. DeMille's great remake of the Ten Commandments. And again, Tadema's preparation in the Coliseum, his last painting, prefigures films of Russell Crowe's films on gladiators. And so Tadema's work still informs our modern art, which is the film industry, and films that we would watch and enjoy. And so whether it's high art or low art, it's important art, and it should be taken seriously, even though we shouldn't necessarily rank it as the most innovative. But Tadema is an interesting figure, and I hope today I've filled in a gap in Victorian art and life that may have been missing from my former talks. And these are some other talks that I shall be giving this year as well, which I can give you information on accessing if you're interested. Okay, I'll share my screen now and I can take questions any minute. Okay.